Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Sanders, and I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome you to Alias Anna, a true story of outwitting the Nazis with Susan Hood and Greg Dawson. We at the museum are committed to our crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate Jewish culture and storytelling, historic and current anti-Semitism, resistance against injustice, and more. We hope you will spend time at the museum and visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, and The Garden of Stones by Andy Goldsworthy. Also keep an eye out for this fall's exhibition opening of Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, our first exhibition for visitors 9 and up about the incredible story of the Danish rescue. You can learn more about the museum, our exhibitions, and our work at mjhnyc.org. And we're very excited and pleased to have Susan back with us on October 15th to talk about her book, Harboring Hope. That's going to be actually the opening of Courage to Act to the public. So we hope you can join us in person for that event, and I believe we'll have a virtual option as well. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Susan Hood is the award-winning author of many books for young readers, including Harboring Hope, the true story of how Henny Sinding helped Denmark's Jews escape the Nazis, Lifeboat 12, Ada's Violin, Shaking Things Up, The Last Straw, Kids vs. Plastics, and Titan and the Wild Boars, the true cave rescue of the Thai soccer team. I'll be posting links to all the books in the chat, especially Alias Anna, and link also to Harboring Hope. Greg Dawson has been a journalist for over 50 years, winning awards for his work as a TV critic, columnist, and feature writer at magazines and newspapers, including the Boston Herald, Indianapolis Star, and Orlando Sentinel. He is the author of 2 books on the Holocaust, Hiding in the Spotlight, and Judgment Before Nuremberg. And he's also the author of Busted in Bloomington, a collective memoir of the 60s written with his wife, Candy Dawson. And he is the co-author of Alias Anna. I will be off camera during the program, but I will be here for questions, comments, or needs, so please post any of those in the chat. You can also post your questions for Susan or Greg in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can after the presentation. Okay, well, thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. We're so thrilled to have you here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Susan Hood.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here with Greg. I think I'm going to start the talk by sharing my screen and show you a few slides that tells the kind of origin story of Alias Anna. Let's see, play from start. Okay. Okay, so Alias Anna is a nonfiction biography in verse about Zhanna Arshanskaya, who is Greg's mom. And we wrote the book together. And so how did all that happen? I was working on my book Lifeboat 12, which was my first middle grade book, also based on a true story. When I was doing my research for this book, I was reading a lot about World War II, and I happened to read Greg's adult book, Hiding in the Spotlight. And so I read that. I read, probably dozens more. I put it aside. I went about my business, finished Lifeboat 12, but I could not stop thinking about these 2 young girls in Hiding in the Spotlight. Here they are, Frina, age 12, and Zhanna, age 14. Both of them were incredible piano prodigies, and they are among the only known survivors of Drobitsky Yar. So I thought because of the girls' ages, it really needed to be a middle grade book, especially because I know a lot of kids start studying the Holocaust when they're in middle school. And I think a lot of kids, as well as adults, have no idea about Drobitsky Yar. It's a bit of lost history. And it really was the crime that kind of started the Holocaust, sort of the Holocaust by bullets, long before the concentration camps were fully built. And it was covered up for decades, first by Hitler, later by Stalin. This memorial was only erected in 2002. It has since been bombed during the war in Ukraine. So I thought it's a really interesting part of the Holocaust that most people don't know about. I also fell in love with the story because it really speaks to the life-saving power of the arts, something that really interests me. And then finally, I was so charmed that this story came out because of an 8th grader. Greg's daughter, Aimee, was in 8th grade. She got one of those typical social studies homework projects. Go home and interview a relative about what was your life like when you were 13. And I think we've all gotten those assignments and you think, oh, ho hum, whatever. But look at what Aimee uncovered. I think Greg knew some of this story, but growing up, he didn't know it, right, Greg?
That's correct. I didn't know anything about this story until I was 30 years old. I can talk about that later on, but before that, all I knew was that my mother was Russian and that she came over after the war, but that was it. The part that we're going to be talking about, that was news to me at age 30.
Yeah, so I just thought that's so wonderful that an 8th grader came up with this story. You know, Zhanna had gotten to America and she buried this story. She didn't tell anybody until her little granddaughter sort of opened that door. So Alias Anna starts with her letter. So I'm going to read you a couple of pages in the beginning of the book. Okay, so the letter says, "Dear Grandma Z, hi, how are you doing? I hope everything is going well for you right now. I'm writing this letter for a school history project we are doing. The project is to find out as much about our grandparents and what was going on when they were 13 years old. Some specific things I would like to know are, what was life like in 1940? What was your home life like? Also, what are some major world events you remember around that time? I would really appreciate it if you would write me back and tell me some more about your life. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and hope to see you soon. Happy holidays. Love, Aimee." So then the poems begin. The first one is called "When Zhanna Was Aimee's Age." How could she answer her granddaughter? Long buried horrors, stifled sorrows. Zhanna had pushed away, pushed down, now came rushing up like bile. Rifles, soldiers, the pit in her stomach. Shoving, bitter cold, icy stares, families lined up, little children, grandparents, people laughing, pointing, taking pictures, humiliation, confusion. What had they done? Where were they going? A bribe, a whisper, running, 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 escape. She had to hide, but where? But how? A new name. She'd hide behind a new identity. That was it. She wouldn't be Zhanna. She'd use an alias. She'd drop the ZH from her name, become Anna, smaller, plainer, more able to blend in. She'd begin again. A for Anna, A for alive. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing this and throw it over to Greg, who's going to talk about doing the research for his book, Hiding the Spotlight. Greg has a short movie to show, so I'll show that first.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to say that to the audience that short excerpt that you read from the book, and let the folks know that the main body of the book was written by Susan. It was her really ingenious design to do it in verse. And I contributed what I could, but this was her creation. And there was always something inherently poetic about this story, sort of epically poetic, that I did my best to convey in Hiding in the Spotlight. But, you know, as a lifetime reporter, and it was so sort of like just the facts, ma'am. And I tried to go beyond that to do the best I could. But Susan really brought the poetic quality of this story to the surface, which is one of the really beautiful things about this book, and why it's a completely new iteration of it that's perfectly suited for the intended audience. Even those who are not in middle school, well beyond. I've heard from many adults who appreciate it on that level as well, because it does have that quality to it. So as far as my research is concerned, to go back, I said briefly, I was 30 years old before my mother really told me the clear, broad outlines of her story. That was actually in 1978. And until then, again, I knew nothing about it. I grew up, was bilingual, as Russian and English, until I was 5 years old. And then I got self-conscious in school, and I asked her to stop speaking Russian to me, and she did. And so really, I didn't even have any sense of her experience during the war. Never asked about my grandparents, which in retrospect is kind of strange, but now I understand it a little bit better. And so anyway, it was not until 1978, when I was 30 years old, I was a columnist for my hometown newspaper in Bloomington, Indiana. And NBC, many of you may remember, had a miniseries that aired that year called Holocaust. It was 9 hours over 3 nights. It was a very big deal because it was the first time American television had really given any kind of meaningful extended treatment of to the Holocaust. So as a columnist, I was always looking for ideas. And this was more than just a TV event. It spread out to as more of a societal event because it touched so many lives in different ways. And I thought there must be a column in here for me somewhere. And so I thought, well, my mother went through World War II. Maybe she would have some memories that sort of connect with this in some way. And so I called her. By that time, she was living in Milwaukee. My dad had died at 62, and so she had moved away from Bloomington to Wisconsin, where she was teaching there. So I called her and I told her about this miniseries coming on the air, and about the Holocaust. And I said, do you have any memories of your experience during the war that might relate to this in any way? And boy, did she. It was at that point, she gave me, I stayed on the phone for about an hour and a half, giving me the first broad outlines of her actual experience of the Nazi invasion and their being sheltered and their fleeing and their amazing story of surviving the war through their music. And it was the first time I had heard any of that. And so it produced a heck of a column for me. And there were people who, like Candy and others, who encouraged me. They said, you should do a book on that. And I thought, no, I don't think so. I'm not really a book writer. Besides that, my mother really doesn't want to talk about it anymore. She made it clear when she spoke to me for the column that would be it, that she did not want to talk about it again. Nevertheless, I went back to her at other people's urging to see if she would agree to do a book, and she's consistently declined and pushed away that idea. So anyway, fast forward from 78, fast forward to 1994, to something Susan alluded to, and that was our daughter Aimee was in middle school, and she came home with this assignment. And she explained that, as Susan said, she was going to write to Z and ask her. And Candy and I both thought, well, good luck with that. We didn't tell her that because we doubted my mother would give her any more information than she did me, and that she didn't really want to talk about it anymore. However, as many people out there probably know from being a grandparent, having grandkids, the relationship between grandparents and grandkids is unique. It's quite different, as we've found out joyfully in the last 3.5 years with our granddaughter Felicity. It's a completely different kind of relationship. So when Aimee asked my mother to confide in her experience, she did that and amazingly did that in a intimate emotional way that she had not done when she outlined the basic narrative to me 14 years earlier. It was quite different. She really it was almost like a catharsis for her. And so she produced an amazing handwritten 4 or 5 page letter to Aimee. And it was like a light switch went on for my mother. And she decided at that point, she realized it was important for Aimee to know this history, and for Aimee's classmates, and for future classes. And from that point on, she became very, very passionate in wanting people to know this story. And she agreed to do the book. And so I started doing research, and at that point, interviewing her, and ultimately a lot of library work, and ultimately going to Ukraine in, when was it? It was 2006. We went to Ukraine, Candy and I. The book was published in 2009. But so that's the basic story of the discovery of the story, and what turned on the light for my mother. And until she finally passed away in January '95, she had dementia in her final years, but she was so passionate in proselytizing for the story, made many trips with us to museums, to schools, to talk about her experience, and also to play. Some of her final performances were for these audiences, including kids kids loved her, and she loved kids, and she was very kid-like herself, even given her terrible experience through the war. And so that's the story of the research. And we have a short, about five-minute film, which is really an excerpt. It's an excerpt of a 17-minute film that Candy made after our trip to Ukraine in 2006. And so I think maybe we can see that now. So yes, if we can see that now. Yeah.
We're opening the doors to a story hidden for 60 years. This little Jewish girl, Zhanna Arshanskia, has finally told her story. She was born in Ukraine on the Sea of Azov in the little fishing village of Bryansk. Her son Greg went back to walk in her footsteps. Greg found the conservatory in the city of Kharkiv, where his mother and her younger sister Frina had studied. Then he found their home, 48 Katsartskia Street. It was behind these doors that his mother and her family had lived, a family that Greg would never know. When the Nazis came calling, only Zhanna and Frina escaped. Greg found the memorial outside the city to the 16,000 Jews of Kharkiv who were told they were going to a labor camp. It was bitterly cold. Dmitry Arshansky had a plan. He turned to a Ukrainian collaborator on the march and said, "Look at me, I'm not a Jew. Turn your head. Let my daughter go. I have something in my pocket to give you. Here, just take it and turn your head." Zhanna jumped out of line, and the rest of the family marched on to Drobitsky Yar. When Greg found the site of the ravine itself, he placed flowers in honor of his family who died and all the 16,000 who perished. He knew what happened there.
Oh my gosh. There they are.
А что, еще двое людей живые, которые тут написано, они живы.
There they
Это
are.
мать и тетя.
Zhanna and Frina.
And you get those
And here are Dmitry and Sarah. Dmitry and Sarah.
Это все
And
исправимо. Интересно.
The Bagancha family in the city of Kharkiv sheltered the girls for 2 weeks. This is Nikolai, Zhanna's classmate, and today His widow lives in that home and opened that gate once more.
Come on in.
The Baganchas couldn't hide the girls any longer, sent them on their way with new non-Jewish identities. But Zhanna couldn't hide her talent. At an orphanage, occupying Nazi soldiers heard her play and brought her into the city to perform for them. Zhanna had to remember her father's parting words, "I don't care what you do, just stay alive." You see her here in the middle of this picture with her head turned, trying to hide her identity. It was the beginning of hiding in the spotlight. Zhanna and Frina perform for the Nazis and Ostworkers throughout the war. Zhanna told the truth that she was a Jew, just like the others in the camps, to Larry Dawson. He helped her and Frina get on the first ship to the United States, and Zhanna and Frina got scholarships to the Juilliard. But there was one more lie that she was hiding, the false birthday from all those years ago.
This is the first time ever since the war started that I could say that my birthday is on April 1st instead of the 25th of December, and I was 80 years old then.
And this is the first time we've ever celebrated her real birthday, April 1st. Well, this is a new birthday celebration, but you're going to have to choose between April 1st and December 25th. You're not going to get double birthdays and double.
Are you sure that I can swing it?
I'm sure. Maybe for 1 year. You get 1 year of double birthdays, and then next year you have to choose.
Maybe I'll become a swindler. Swinging.
This year you get double. Next year it's one or the other.
That'd be a long explanation.
I should say that the film at the end explained that it was my mother playing her favorite piece, Fantasy Impromptu, and the sheet music you saw on one of the slides that Susan showed. That is the original sheet music that she saved. It's the only thing she saved from their home when they were rousted out of their homes by the Nazis, and she ran back and saved that 5 pieces of sheet music, and somehow miraculously to this day, maybe the biggest miracle of the story is how she managed to preserve 5 pages of sheet music through really almost 5 years of war, in which they were continually on the move across Europe in different places, from Ukraine to Berlin to DP camp. It's an amazing. I wish I asked her how she managed to do that. She said, well, I just put it inside my shirt. Well, maybe for an afternoon or 2 hours or, a few days, but for 5 years, it's a miraculous thing. So we have that sheet music, and we've trying to preserve it as the best we can. It's extremely perishable, but that's the story behind that sheet music. And one other thing I wanted to say about what you saw in the film is that, I knew that I didn't know much about the Holocaust or Ukraine before I did my research. What I was not fully aware of is how little anybody else knew. Keep in mind, this is I started doing my research around 2000, between 2000, 2006, and 2007. And I was amazed at the information I was finding about Drobitsky Yar, for example, to the extent that most Americans had heard about Ukraine. They'd heard the name Babi Yar, which was really the most famous killing site in Ukraine. Most people never even associated with Ukraine per se. They knew the famous poem by Yevtushenko, which came out in 1961. But 33,000 Jews were slaughtered there in September of 1941.
when the German killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, swept through Ukraine, and then east to west, west to east rather, and then Drobitsky Yar, close to Kharkov, outside Kharkov, 16,000, estimated 16,000 Jews were murdered there, and that's where Zhanna's parents and grandparents perished, and where she and Frina barely escaped that fate. But one of the real values of this Alias Anna is that it's going to expose another audience to what is really what was a lost chapter in Holocaust history, arguably really the opening chapter, because that is where upward of 1 million Jews were slaughtered in Ukraine by early 1942, even before any of the death camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka or the others were even operation. They began operation in the spring of 1942, and so really, in a real sense, Ukraine was really the dawn of the Holocaust, and that just simply is never. It was not really known in this country, and it's just becoming known. Again, Alias Anna is an important addition to that. So, Susan, did you want to pick it up from there with any thoughts?
I guess we could open it up to questions. If people have questions, we're happy to answer them.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Susan and Greg. We'll turn over to some audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, feel free to post it in the Q&A box, and you can also put it in the chat, and we will get to them. The first question we received, did Aimee know anything about World War II at the time?
Good question. I think the answer is probably no. I mean, she was in middle school, but middle school texts, as you know, history texts tend to be very, very broad in general. I'm sure she knew about World War II, but to any significant depth, detail, I don't think so. No, and so there was never an occasion for her to ask about it. So no, she didn't. This was besides the basic outlines of it that would have been covered in a textbook. No, she didn't. By that time, I think we had told her maybe a little bit about what that we knew about my mother's story, but it wasn't something we really told her a lot about as she was growing up.
And thank you, everyone, for posting these great questions. Someone wants to know about Frina and what happened to her. And I think this ties into another question. Please tell a brief summary of how they got through the war.
Yes. To whoever asked that question, that is always probably among the first 1 or 2 or 3 questions that are asked is what happened to Frina. The short answer is we don't know for sure. When I decided to do the book, and my mother did interviews with me, my next step was to speak to Frina, because it was her story, her experience as well. And so I asked her if she would share her story, share the story through her eyes, and she declined twice. And the second time, it was actually through her husband, who said that she really didn't want to share that experience. It was too private and too personal. And too painful to share it with anybody else. He said, please don't ask again. And so I respected that. And so at that point, it was speculation as to how Frina escaped. We just don't know. Different people have different theories. One is that, my mother managed to escape. We now know maybe within a mile or 2 of the actual killing field, Drobitsky Yar. The thought is that Frina may have escaped in much the same way, run out of line into the woods. And before they got in the final 2 miles there, before they got to the Drobitsky Yar. Another theory is that she got there with her parents. They were shot and thrown into the pit.
that she was thrown in there too, and lay there until the Nazis left and then crawled out. That has actually been, there have been cases like that were documented, a few cases where people were in the pit and crawled out afterward when the Germans left. There are other theories, but we just don't know. One other I'll mention is that came from someone who kind of knew Frina as a student, as a student of Frina's when she came to this country, is that they were supposed to both run out of line at the same time, and that Frina was holding her mother's hand. Frina was much more of a homebody growing up than my mother, much more sort of attached to her mother in that way. And that when the moment came for them to run out of line, Frina simply couldn't let go of her hand, her mother's hand. She just couldn't do it. And so, but then of course that leaves the question, how did she leave? How did she escape after that? Don't know, but it's a real mystery. Frina passed away 5 or 6 years ago, and we don't know. Her husband, Ken, who also passed away a number of years ago, also a fine pianist. Ken said that in a letter to me, said that only he knew the real story and he was not going to share it. So that's unfortunately the most we can offer people who ask that question, because it's always among the first two or three questions asked. Oh, a short history. Oh, short history. Very short history of how they got through the war. Basically what they did is they created new identities, non-Jewish identities, Anna and Marina Morozova, and they went from place to place, city, town to town, as disguised Jews, and they wanted to sort of stay under the radar in an orphanage for the duration of the war. But in the first orphanage they got into, their talent was discovered by a piano tuner who heard them playing. He insisted they come into town and be part of that large group you saw as performers, and one in which my mother's looking away. And basically from that time on, they were performing as the title of the book said, they were hiding in the spotlight. They were performing for the Germans, for the Nazis, for large groups of German GIs, basically 100. Also at private dinners with Gestapo and field generals and so on, who didn't know their identity. And so they basically made their way through the war like that. They were even for a year and a half, they were in Berlin, and where they did the same thing. So that's basically how they made it through the war. And they managed to keep their identities concealed and through the war. My mother thinks it's possible that the German officers, maybe some knew or guessed that they were Jews, but she and Frina were more valuable to the Nazis alive than dead. They needed them to help entertain their troops. And so in any case, whether it was one case or the other, they managed to, that's how they got really through the war.
Thanks so much, Greg. We have this question, and again, thank you everyone for these really wonderful questions you're putting in. There are two together of the person is assuming Zhanna married Mr. Dawson, the soldier, who she confided in. Is that true? Was he Jewish? And another person just wants to know about your father.
Okay. No, good guess, but no, she actually married, that man was Larry Dawson. He was the Army lieutenant who ran that particular displaced persons camp and spotted them. But actually, my mother ended up marrying Larry's brother, David. My father, David, was the violin prodigy who went to Juilliard. And so when my mother came to this country and herself went to Juilliard, she ultimately met David, and that's who she married. And the other question, part of that question was
to tell about your father.
My father. Well, gosh, he first of all, he died at 62, basically from emphysema and smoking, and that's a shame. That he missed all this part of our lives in telling this story. But He's a wonderful guy, just a prodigy. He got a scholarship to Juilliard when he was 14 years old, full scholarship. He grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and wonderful guy. Other musicians who wrote about him, talked about him after his death, said that like any virtuoso, he was wonderful and he understood the music, he interpreted it well, he said, but the thing that set him apart was he had kind of an unearthly tone and beauty to his playing that was just extraordinary and something that very few people had. At the same time, great sense of humor, an absolutely terrible, wonderful punster, and a baseball fan. And so he was a great dad as long as I had him. And so that's kind of who my dad was.
The question now is, how did you know where to go to start your research? And assuming you learned a lot along the way. And then I'm interested, Susan, how the two of you worked together to tell this story, if you could go into that process too.
Susan, why don't you go ahead and take that?
Oh, sure. It was such an incredibly wonderful experience. When I had the idea to do a middle grade book, I happened to be going down to speak to some teachers at the University of Florida, and Greg lives in Florida. So I said, can we get together and talk about this? So we had lunch and with all our husbands and wives, and then they invited us back to their apartment where they showed us this movie you've just seen. We ended up talking for what I thought was about 2 hours. And so we got up to leave, and I don't think any of us realized it, but we had been talking for 5 hours. So obviously all of us were very interested in this idea. I didn't know if it was going to work because I had done a historical fiction book in verse. I wasn't sure if nonfiction in verse was going to work. So I said, let me go home, let me try it, and, as Greg says, throw some spaghetti up against the wall, see if it sticks. And I think it did work. So then Greg was so generous, and this was all during COVID. So all the museums and libraries I would usually consult were all closed. And Greg was just very generous and wonderful. And he handed me, 100 pages of interviews with your mom. And then there were a couple of things in museums up online that I could look at. But every time I had a question, he was right on it. So it was a fantastic experience. And I've said, and Greg's so funny too. I really enjoyed working with him. So I've said, maybe I don't want to write any other books unless Greg gets to work with me. So.
My feelings exactly. So, but again, I said it at the start, I just want to say it again. When we were I was all for doing this project with Susan, because again, I really wanted to do all I could to increase the awareness of this story, and this book obviously was an opportunity to do that. But what she produced was far beyond what I had expected or even conceived of, because of the manner in which she did it, and again, it was so important. I mean, music to me is the purest form of art, because it expresses what is really inexpressible to in other forms of art, and one thing that and music is a, as I said in the beginning, there's a poetic musical quality to this story that she managed to put on the page with her iteration of it that I wasn't able to fully. And so I was very grateful. I read it, I was amazed, and I thought, wow, this is just expanding the whole, is making it from a 2-dimensional maybe to a 3-dimensional version of the story.
You can imagine when I handed it over to them, I was just on pins and needles going, oh, please let me live up to Zhanna's incredible story. And Greg's such a great journalist. And so I was very nervous. And he and Candy wrote back and just were so happy, which made me so happy.
Let me also mention one other thing that's really another unexpected benefit and pleasure of this whole project was that when HarperCollins said they were going to publish it, they decided they also wanted to do, as many books get, they wanted to do an audiobook. And so we were talking about this as a family, and we told Aimee about the project. We said, oh, there's going to be an audiobook too. And she said, well, could I do it? And Aimee is a very good speaker, and she had a bit of experience in high school and radio, and but had never done anything like this. And we said, well, publisher like HarperCollins, they have, I think, a whole stable of professionals who do this sort of thing. And she said, well, can I try? And I said, sure, yeah, go ahead, knock yourself out. And so she said, I'm just going to, so what she did is she did a sample audition. She taped it herself. She reading part of the book, part of the manuscript. And she sent it off to HarperCollins, and they got back to her and they said, hey, this is great. Sure, you can do it. And so the audiobook is actually read by Aimee, which is very special to us. And to have, because of what I told you earlier about the story, the fact that it was Aimee who got my mother to divulge her, to unburden herself of this, and to have Aimee be able to be the one to do the audiobook is very special for us. And another thing is that by the time the book came out, my mother, dementia was pretty deep and she was not able to read, but we did send her, she was able to listen to the audiobook. And we like to think that just the voice, the sound of Aimee's voice, she may have gotten something from that. A lot of times when people with dementia, they have thoughts and feelings they can't express. And that she had a caregiver who told us that when my mother was listening to it, there were times when she would kind of smile and nod her head, not certain what that was, but we thought maybe some of this is getting through. And so that was something that was extraordinary that we didn't expect.
Yeah, Aimee did a fantastic job, and it made me so happy to know that Zhanna was listening to her voice.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Susan, a question for you. You had said that you decided to write the book in verse. An attendee's wondering why you did end up deciding to do that. And then another part of that, we know that these are the books that you write, but why did you decide to write the book for middle school children as opposed to adults, and specifically why was it so important for that to be the right age group that this story, people would be able to know about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't write for adults. I've never written an adult book. I always write for children. I started out writing picture books, and then Lifeboat 12 was my very first book for middle grade, and I wrote that in verse, and I had such a wonderful time doing it. And then it got a phenomenal response from kids. And so I think that format is becoming very popular for middle schoolers for a couple of reasons. All that white space on the page is less daunting than heavy text. So I think even reluctant readers, or what they're calling striving readers, don't feel like the book is so scary to get into. It also is a good buffer for when you're talking about pretty scary, horrible things. You have white space to sort of give you a little insulation from all that. And for Alias Anna, I just really wanted to reflect the music, which was so important to her story. So I thought verse was the perfect way to do that. I really wanted to tell this story to middle schoolers because of all the Holocaust deniers who are out there. A lot of the survivors are all starting to die off. Zhanna lived to be 95 years old, but she just died in January. And I think we are in great danger of losing those stories. So I just think it's really, really important to share those stories with kids in an age-appropriate way. So this book is for ages 10 and up, whereas Lifeboat 12 was for 8 to 14-year-olds. So I think we were very, very careful to try to target it to the right age group.
Let me say, I'd like to emphasize the and up part of that, because I've heard from a lot of adults, who read the book, who loved it. And I mean, think of Charlotte's Web. I mean, I guess if you were going to age, if you're going to put an age on that, you might not think it's for adults, but I mean, it's a marvelous, it didn't matter how old you are. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And this book, I think, has been enjoyed by plenty of adults that we've spoken with. And I'll say something else. Because the history of Ukraine, the Holocaust in Ukraine, is still so dimly understood, any adult who reads this book will end up knowing more about the Holocaust in Ukraine than the average person, way more. Because there's plenty, this is a magical story in many ways, but there's also plenty of information in here, not just about what happened to my mother, but also life under Stalin, and the fact that the famine that he created in Ukraine. There's a lot of information in here, but it's woven in so beautifully that it goes down very easily. And also, if you haven't seen the book, and Susan's talking about verse and a lot of white space, yes, that's true. But there's also some brilliant graphics work by the designers, creative graphic work with swirls and all sorts of things. That's a tip, yes, but that doesn't have there's some other. Anyway, throughout the book, there's brilliant graphic stuff, and the cover.
I like the map.
Knocked out by the cover. There's a map too.
There's a map showing their travels.
Yep, exactly. And of course, the brilliant cover here, showing that scarf of piano keys, which so beautifully epitomizes the story. So
I'd like to give a shout out to the illustrator. So the Balbuso twins. So they're twin sisters doing a book about sisters. So they did such a good job. I think they submitted 3 covers, and this one just stood out so beautifully. So iconic with that scarf. So we all said, yes, please, that one.
We did have a question about the cover, so I'm very glad we could cover it.
Yeah.
Greg, to go back to you, we have 2 people who are interested in knowing if they escaped separately. How did the sisters reconnect?
Yes. Obviously, they escaped separately. My mother, when she escaped, she went back to Kharkiv, and she went back there. And on her way back, we're talking about maybe 8 to 10 miles, 8 to 12 miles to return. She did that, of course, in great jeopardy because the country was crawling with Nazis, and so all she knew was to go back to Kharkiv. So she went back. On her way back, she knocked on doors of people to let her in to shelter there for the night, and for a while before she continued her journey back. And she had doors slammed in her face because people were terrified. If you were caught harboring a Jew, not only the Jew would be murdered, but you would be too. So ultimately, she made it back to Kharkiv, and she ended up at the home that you saw in the film, the Bogancha family. They took her in without question, which was courageous on their part. They were Christians. They put their lives on the line by taking her in. So my mother, they took her in. Sometime later, let's see, how long is it now? I think it's maybe several days, maybe a week later, word got out on the street that Frina was alive, that Frina was in town, and at a different, being kept somewhere else. And arrangements were made for them to reconnect in the home of the Boganchas. And that's where they reconnected, and the Boganchas helped them make up a new narrative for their lives and new names. And they stayed there 2 weeks before having to leave, because the Boganchas could not risk keeping them longer than that for the reason I mentioned. And the Nazis were looking everywhere for the Jews. And so they headed out on their own after 2 weeks. But that's how the girls reconnected after escaping.
That's amazing. Thanks so much for telling us that part of the story. We have a question here also for Greg about just your upbringing. If you could share how you were brought up. People were wondering if you were raised Jewish, and did you inherit any of the musical talent from your family?
I have to laugh. I can't believe that last question. I swear I accuse my wife of planting that question in every audience we speak to, because people always ask me that question. The answer is no, I did not get any of that talent. And I could be bitter about it, but I'm not. And because I know that such talent is distributed very randomly. But I did. Thing is about having, I took piano lessons and flute lessons for a while when I was a kid. But here's the great thing about having parents who are real musicians. They know when you don't have any talent. And so after a while, they didn't have to listen to me for very long to think, this is not happening for this kid. And so they didn't waste much money on my music lessons. About my upbringing. Yes. Now, my father grew up Roman Catholic. And when he went off to New York, he kind of fell away from that. And my mother grew up in a secular home. They were Jewish. They were proudly Jewish, culturally Jewish, but they were secular. They did not go to synagogue. And so I grew up in a secular home. But it was a very Jewish upbringing. Why? Because my parents were on the faculty of the Indiana University School of Music faculty. And at that time, especially, a great percentage of their colleagues were Jewish. And so, we had in our home, we had parties, mostly Jewish colleagues. And so we had in our home, we had Jewish humor, Jewish food, Jewish music, Jewish comedy, humor, everything but the religion. And so in that sense, it was actually a very Jewish upbringing, although it was secular.
Thanks, Greg. Can you also tell us a bit? I know you've spoken about this already a bit, but more on why, or what your thoughts are on why the Holocaust and this story really didn't come up as you were growing up. And we know many people, many survivors didn't speak about their story till later. And do you have thoughts on that for your family, why this story wasn't spoken about and you didn't learn about it till later?
Well, I can say specifically in my mother's case, I think each family, each survivor is going to be different. It's an important, in many families, Jewish families, it became an important part of their family history, especially if they were religious Jews and went to synagogue and so on, and were with other Jews who were involved, were survivors, had survivors. But in our case, I asked my mother that question, and her answer was really quite simple. She said that she wanted me and my brother Bill, who's 2 years younger, she wanted us to have normal, happy childhoods and growing up in Southern Indiana. And she felt that, in her words, she said, telling young children, this story was too cruel. And so she did not want to burden us with that. And that is her specific reason for not telling us. She wanted us to have really normal childhoods, and we did. We had normal, happy childhoods. And so her decision was right for us in our family. It's going to be different judgments from family to family. I will say this, that after doing Hiding the Spotlight, I discovered there's an entire genre of books that are written by second-generation survivors like me, who were told when they were children, unlike me, were told from an early age by their survivor parents about the experience. And they meant well. They thought it was important for the children to know. It was part of their Jewish upbringing. But a lot of these children a lot of these people who heard the story early as children found that when they got to be teenagers and young adults, they began having psychological problems they couldn't account for, because in every other way they had happy childhoods. And many of them who went into therapy discovered that they had repressed these stories that they had heard when they were too young to process them. I mean, it's difficult enough
for an adult to try to make sense of the Holocaust, much less a young child, and that these people had really suffered from these repressed memories of the Holocaust. So my mother made the right decision for us, but again, I know it's going to vary from family to family. It was quite common, as you were saying, Gabriel, that it's quite common for Holocaust survivors not to share their stories until maybe ever, in some cases, not until many years later, as in my mother's case.
Thank you, Greg. We're nearing the end of the hour here, so we'll do just a few more questions and then wrap up. And thank you, everyone, for staying and for your very insightful questions. I guess, Susan, and then we'll have one closing question for Greg. I know you did speak about this in your writing for middle age that you do. Can you take us through that process a little? Someone's wondering about what makes a book 10 plus rather than adult. How do you write it differently? I think it's interesting for us to learn the language you use, how you approach really being a writer for that age group. And I think a lot of us probably are unfamiliar with how that happens and how you've developed that over the years.
Yeah, I do a lot of school visits, sort of across the country and even internationally. And so I'm around kids a lot. And I've come to understand, what they can process and what they can't. You have to take a kid's experience into account. Are they going to understand this word? Are they going to understand this metaphor? So you can't have, adult metaphors that they won't make heads nor tail of. You've got to relate it to their age group and try to explain things in terms that are relevant to their own lives. So I'm very careful. I mean, I'm not one of those people that says, oh, it's a big word, we can't have that word, because I think it's good for kids to have a bigger vocabulary, but I choose those words carefully and try to give them enough context. So I think it's just a matter of being around kids, trying to see what they understand, what they don't. I learn a lot from school visits because I get questions and it's like, oh, that's how you're perceiving this. That's really interesting. So, and I spent the past 30 plus years writing for kids. So I think it is very different. The other thing that's really different is with kids, I always want to try to choose a subject matter that it may be sad, but there's hope involved in the story. You don't want to, a lot of adult books are very ambivalent and, maybe I think kids' books, you want to end with some hope. So I think those are the stories I look for.
And that's a great segue to Harboring Hope that I
yeah.
mentioned at the start of our program tonight. Susan, I mentioned, will join us in October at the launch of our exhibition on the Danish Rescue to talk about her book, Harboring Hope. Greg, I want to ask just a question in closing to you, and then we'll do a brief wrap up. First, someone just mentioned about your film and was wondering if it's been to festivals or and is encouraging you to submit it to. There's a great festival in Pittsburgh, Jewish Film Festival, and I'm sure people would love to see it, and it'd be great for it to be far and wide. But I like this question: why did Zhanna decide to celebrate her birthday of those two dates on the 12/25? So if you could let us know that.
Okay. First of all, the film, Candy's film, this was a 5-minute excerpt of her 18-minute film, which actually she submitted to a film festival near Orlando here, and it was chosen as an official selection of that film festival some years ago. And thank you for mentioning that film festival in Pittsburgh. We should look that up and perhaps submit it there. Forgive me, what was the next part of the question I was going to...
About in the film, we see you tell her you have to pick one.
Oh yes, the birthday. Yes. Well, the thing is that she had made up a new birthday for reasons I won't go into now because it's sort of complicated. But anyway, her real birthday was April 1st, but when they made up their new identities, she chose Christmas Day. And which was, growing up, it was always kind of a nuisance, having somebody with a birthday and on Christmas. It was kind of like you had to celebrate both on the same day and listen. So anyway, after the book came out, it revealed her actual birthday. At that point, since the book mentioned both, I said, well, which one are you going to, which one are you going to celebrate from now on? Which one? The one that we've known all these years or the actual one? And so she made her choice to April 1st. And of course, when she told me after so many years that her birthday wasn't Christmas Day, but in fact it was April Fool's Day, I said, please give me a break. Come on, April Fool's Day? And she said, yes, actually. So it was just, that was her choice. And if I may, one thing I wanted to mention is that you remember we saw earlier the Bogancia family that sheltered my mother and Frina more than 80 years ago. There's a wonderful unexpected sequel that happened this year that came out of the blue. The great grandson of that family, of that couple who took my mother and Frina in, his family, a Bogancia family, fled Ukraine when Russia invaded, and they fled to Austria. We were working with an organization in California to help bring Ukrainian refugees who wanted to come to this country to get here. And we didn't know anything about the Bogancia family, had no connection, no contact with them at all over the years. And the organization said there was a family in Austria that had a young man, 18 years old. They wanted to get him to this country so he could continue his education, his higher education. And so we helped. We said, sure, we'll do what we can. We said, who is he? He said, well, his name is Alex Bogancia. And he's turned out to be the great grandson of the family that sheltered my mother. So it was like a full circle in which we were able to pay back over 80 years later, to pay back the favor to the same family that helped my mother and Frina, which was involved an amazing series of coincidences and events for that to happen. But that happened this year. And there was a story that LA Times did a beautiful story on it in April when it happened. And now the whole family is over. First, Alex came by himself, and the rest of the family, his parents and sister, arrived about a little more than a month ago. So that was an unexpected sequel to this entire story spanning more than 80 years.
It's incredible to see this story continue. I just wanted to see if either Greg or Susan, you have any other words in closing before I wrap up?
I just would like to thank the museum for hosting us. It's been so fun to talk about the book and see Greg, because we don't get to see each other very often across the country. But yeah, I'm very happy to help share Zhanna's amazing story.
Well, likewise, we had a wonderful time at the museum in December, right? It was December we were there. And then the opportunity to do this again is just it's great. It's a wonderful continuation of this. And so thank you, Gabriel, to you and everybody there to make this possible. And Susan, to you, thanks again for really making this happen by producing such a beautiful book. So, take the rest of the week.
Couldn't have done it without you.
It was our pleasure.
Well, we're so appreciative of you both. Susan and Greg were at the New York Jewish Book Festival, our inaugural one last December. We are hosting it again this December. So details coming soon about this year's event, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation with Greg and Susan and continuing to tell this story and the new iterations it takes too. And again, I have mentioned Susan's event on October 15th that we'll be hosting at the museum for the opening of Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, our new exhibition for people ages 9 and up. So just want to thank Greg and Susan so much for being here with us. We are so grateful to have your partnership at the museum. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at another event soon.